In this video, we're going to put together a basic admin for our roles. So I really want people to be able to, or admins of the site to be able to add and remove roles without having to go and edit the database. And I want that because roles are going to play a big part in the way that we authenticate users. And I kind of have to put some sort of role admin together before we move on to the ability for the site to allow or disallow a user from logging into the game based on what role that they are in. So let's go ahead and do that. This should be pretty straightforward. First of all, I'm going to hop into our data project. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a Boolean property on our role object, and I want to indicate to the backend and to our front end what roles are built into the system and what roles are added by a user. For example, I don't want users to be able to modify or delete the admin or the registered role, but I still want them to be able to add their own roles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a public bool is user defined. Now, this Boolean will indicate whether or not it's acceptable for this role to be deleted or edited from the admin panel. So is user defined. Let's go open up our package manager console, and I'll say add migration, add is user defined to roles. Hit enter and let Entity Framework do its magic. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and update our database so our schema gets updated. I mean, seriously guys, I've done a lot of web development and had to deal with a lot of databases, and so far I have not seen a single solution for managing your database schema that is even close to being as convenient as Entity Framework's migration system. I mean, it's just really nice. Just being able to edit your classes, create the migration, and auto-run them. But now that we've done that, let's hop into our database context, or sorry, our migration configuration. And what I want to do here is for my role, register role, and admin role, I want to ensure that is user defined is always set to false. Now, false is the default for the Boolean type, so this doesn't really make a difference, but it makes it a little bit more explicit for us. Okay, so now that I've done that, let's build up the admin. So to build up the admin, the first thing we got to do is jump into our web project. I'm going to scope it to our web project. I'm going to go into our admin's namespace, and I'm going to add a new class called Roles Controller. Roles Controller will have an authorize attribute, and I want to make sure I grab the authorize attribute from System Web MVC, not System Web HTTP. I will say this, however, ASP.NET Next, the next version of ASP.NET, is going to come here pretty soon. I'm pretty sure within the year. And one of the features it's going to actually do finally is it's going to integrate ASP.NET MVC with Web API. They'll still technically be two different products, but we won't have cases like what we're staring at right now on the screen, where there are two authorized attributes, one in the HTTP namespace and one in the MVC namespace. Because if I added the authorized attribute from the HTTP namespace, nothing would happen because it's not tied into MVC. So we want to make sure we grab the MVC one. I'll also say roles equals admin because I want to ensure that only admins can access the roles controller. We'll have this inherit from controller. We're going to create a couple action results, or a couple actions. We're going to have our index action, which is going to return view new roles index. I'm just going to be stubbing out all of my actions here. We're going to have the create action, return view new roles create. We're going to have the HTTP post create action, which takes in a roles create form. We're going to have the HTTP post public AR delete int ID action. We're going to have, in this case, we're just going to return content blah, just so that it'll compile. But when we actually, I'll just do it right. I'll say return redirect to action index, because that's what the delete is going to do after it's done deleting. Then we're going to have a public AR edit that takes in an int ID and that returns a view of new roles edit. Then we're going to have an HTTP post action edit that takes in an ID and also takes in a roles edit form and simply returns view form. And I think that just about wraps up our controller stub. Now again, this is just a controller stub. I want to stub out my controller, my view models, and my views, and then we'll go and we'll implement the controller actions one by one. So next up, let's write our view models. So we need 3 view models, our roles index, our roles create, and our roles edit. So go into our view models namespace, and we're going to need roles index. Now roles index is going to have a public IEnumerable of role called roles. So that's what our roles index class will look like. Again, it's just going to show a list of roles to our admin, so we need an IEnumerable of roles to do that. Next up, let's do our roles create. Roles create will have a public string name. It's going to be required, and it's going to have a max length. I honestly cannot remember what the max length that we set it to. So just give me 1 second. We set it to 128. That sounds like a reasonable thing to set it to. So we're going to set the max length of the name of role create to 128. And that's actually it for our roles create, because roles really just have names. So that's all good. Now let's jump into our view models namespace again and add the roles edit action or view model. Roles edit will basically be the exact same as roles create. It'll have a public string name, which will be required, and it will have a max length of 128. Okay, so that's our roles create, roles edit, and roles index. Let's jump into our roles controller, get that using view models up at the top, and now our code compiles. Okay, so let's start off with implementing the views for our index and our create. Then we'll jump back into our controller and implement our controller actions for index and create. Because we can't really test the delete and the edit until we can create. So let's hop into views, and what we're going to do is we're going to need to create a folder called roles. Then we're going to need to create a Razor MVC view, and we're going to call it index. Index will have a model of roles index. Now that's going to autocomplete to include the namespace. Everything else will be deleted. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my users index, put it side by side, so that I can match the same format that I used on my users. So I'm going to say h1 is roles. Actually, I'm going to change users index h1 to just say users, because that sounds a lot better. I'm going to put in an action link to create role with linking to create and empty route values. And then for the HTML attributes, I'll pass in a class of button, button default, and button small. I like small buttons. I really don't like big buttons. Some people like big buttons, but I don't. Okay, so now we have our create role button. We can now write our table. Our table will be class of table, table striped. We'll have a t head. Our t head will have a single row, and the row will have, let's just put ID in, ID name actions. That's really all we need. Now let's do our t body. Our t body will loop over all of our roles for each var role in model.roles. Then we'll print out a row with a column for role.id, another column for role.name. Then we have to do something interesting here. Like I said, I only want user-defined roles to be editable or deleteable. So we're going to have to put an if statement in here that'll check to see if a role can be modified. That being said, I really don't like the idea of our view being coupled with a property that isn't as semantic as I would like it to be. Think about it this way. We want the view to ask the role if we can edit it, right? But the role only has a bit of data called isUserDefined. Now, it's true that right now those two things, the persistence and the view logic, kind of correspond to each other, because we can simply say if role is user defined, then show them the edit button. We could do that because right now they're coupled, but conceptually I don't like that, because conceptually the concept of asking a role if we can edit it, I believe, is a fundamentally different question than asking the role if it's user defined, even if for right now they're based on each other. The difference that I see in this particular scenario is that isUserDefined is an attribute. It's a piece of data on role. It's not really asking a question about whether or not we can edit it. It's a piece of data that's persisted to the database. So what I want to do is I want to write a property that is based off the isUserDefined, but isn't mapped to a row in the database, and that property will determine if the role is editable or not. Which means that since we'll be asking the role about whether we can edit it through this property, we'll be able to change that behavior in the future, independent of whether or not isUserDefined is true or false. So that's kind of where I want to go with this. So let's go ahead and create a property and make sure that it's not going to be mapped by Entity Framework. To do that, we'll first write our property. So I'll say public bool can edit or delete, or can edit and delete, which will have a simple getter, and it'll say return isUserDefined. Now there's a slight problem with this, and that is that Entity Framework will try to map this property. Now this isn't a bit of data that we want to persist in the database, it's just a computed property that we want to be able to use to add custom logic to our domain model. Well, actually this isn't really a domain model, but you know what I mean. So what I want to do instead is inform Entity Framework that I don't want to map this. That is actually pretty easy to do, because we simply supply the not mapped attribute, which is part of System Component Model Data Annotations schema. So import that namespace and you will get a not mapped property or attribute. By applying that to our property, Entity Framework will not try to do something stupid and map this computed property. So now what we can do is jump back into our view and put together or finish our actions column. So I'm going to say if role.canEdit and delete, then we're going to go ahead and put in our buttons. So let's put in our edit and delete buttons. I'm going to say ahref url.action edit action edit new role.id. We're going to give it a class of button, button extra small, button primary. I do want to wrap this also in a button group, so I will be adding a div up here called button-group to both our edit and our delete buttons, just to make things consistent between the different parts of our admin. Next up, we'll add in an icon for glyph icon edit, and then we'll type in edit. Then we want our delete action. So our delete action will be ahref url action delete new role.id. For our class, for our delete, we want to make sure that we give it the button, button extra small, button danger, and the post. Because remember, we're going to be wanting to post our or post to the delete action as opposed to executing a GET request to our delete action. So to do that, we need to add the class button, button extra small, button danger, and then post, and then we want to give it a data message of are you sure you want to delete role.name question mark. Then inside this A tag, we will add a glyph icon remove, and we'll put in delete. Finally, at the end of this, if we cannot edit or delete this role, I'm just going to write n-a. You'll notice something interesting about the syntax right here. I have to open up with a @ symbol colon, because if I don't, it'll try to interpret this as C# code. The reason it's trying to interpret this as C# code is because the block immediately containing it is a C# block. Now you'll notice that if we're inside of a div or an A tag or something like that, we can just put in whatever we want as text, and Razor understands to treat it as text and print it out. But when we're directly inside of a C# construct, we need to annotate what we want to be printed as text. There's a couple ways around this. I could wrap this in a span tag, something like that. I could also wrap this in text, which text is a special Razor attribute or special Razor element that won't be printed out to the HTML, and it basically forces Razor to understand it as HTML and not C#. Text has been around, I believe, since Razor 1, but later versions of Razor introduced the @ syntax, which allows you to treat all the rest of the symbols on this line will now be treated as text, because I've prefixed the line with an @. So that's a cool new feature of Razor. I think it's been around since version 2 of Razor, actually. Because I'm pretty sure when Razor came out it didn't have this, and that caused a lot of frustration because the text element's really ugly, in my opinion. It's wrapped in that horrible yellow background, and it makes my eyes bleed. Okay, so this is our index action for our roles. Let's go ahead and write our create view next. So write our index and our create, and then we'll write the corresponding controller actions for them, and then we'll test it. And then we can finish off with our edit and our delete. So in the roles folder, I'm going to add a new Razor MVC view called create. And this folder, or this view, will have a model of roles create. And then I'm going to delete everything else. And then just like before, I'm going to open up my users just to make sure that I have a consistent look of everything throughout the admin. Okay, so let's go ahead and write our h1, which will be create role. We'll do using html.begin form. We'll do html.validation summary. Next up, we'll open up a form row. We'll do our HTML label for our name, because our name is our only property on our view model. Then we want our text box for name. And then we want to make sure to give our text box a form control class. Now that's the only property that we have to worry about, so we can go straight down to our p tag, where we do our input type equals submit, value equals create role, class is button, button default, button small, and then we say or HTML action link go back index. So that's our create role form. If we were to navigate to this page now, not a whole lot of things would happen. So let's write our controller actions for our index and for our create before we test it out. These two methods that we're about to write should be pretty painless. So our index action is simply going to set the roles property to our database, a database query that queries for all of our roles. So what I need to do is at the top of this file, I need to say private read-only MMO database context underscore database equals new MMO database context. Then I'll say roles equals database dot roles, and then I just want to say toList. What this will do is this will perform the query inside of this line of code immediately, so that when the view enumerates over the roles property, it isn't invoking another query. Remember, by doing .toList, we're executing the query immediately and then yielding or taking all of the results of the query, stuffing them into a list, and then returning that list. So that's exactly the behavior that we're looking for in a controller. Next up, we have our action result create. However, this will be empty because there's nothing that we want to set on our view model The only reason we even have a view model for create is because of the name property that we're going to be typing into the form. For our post action, we're going to want to say if not model state is valid, return view form, so that the user gets told about the errors and they can fix them. Then we want to say var role equals new role, which of course will require that I bring in a using statement for buzzmmo.data.entities. And then I'm going to say name equals form.name. Then I'm going to say is user defined, and I'm going to set that to true. Then I'm going to say database roles add role, database save changes, return redirect to action index. So that'll simply create the role and bring us back to the index page. The last thing I want to do before we test this out is to go under our areas admin views shared. I want to hop into the layout here. I want to add a new navigation link to roles. So I want to say up here on my navbar, I want to say li, wait a year and a half, wait even longer because Visual Studio is thinking about crashing right now. There we go. HTML action link roles index roles. All right, let's go ahead and hop into our admin and hit refresh. And we should see a fancy little roles icon or roles menu item at the top here in a second, which we do. Click on roles, and now we see we have our admin and our registered roles. And we also see that actions are not available, which is exactly what we want. Let's create a role, and notice that I got something wrong with my indentation on that create form. What did I get wrong? Ooh, it's not form row, it's form group. I did that earlier too, didn't I? I'm just so used to typing form row because that's typically the helper class that I used to write before I started using Bootstrap. Yeah, now our margins are correct. All right, let's first try to test our error conditions. If I type in nothing, it says the name field is required, which is exactly what we want. If I type in more than 128 characters, it says, there we go. The field name must be a string or array type with a maximum length of 128, which is exactly what we want. So let's write a role called beta testers, create role, and you see here we now have not only the crazy role that I added, but also our new role called beta testers. And you'll also notice that these have an edit and delete button. Let's test the delete button. I should get a message, and it does indeed give me a message. If I hit cancel, it doesn't do anything, which is exactly what we want. If I hit OK, nothing happens. Well, actually something did happen. What happened is we did indeed post to the delete action, but it immediately redirected us back to the index action. So let's go ahead and implement our delete action. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say var role equals database.roles.findID. Then I'm going to say if role is null or not role can edit and delete, return HTTP not found. Otherwise, database roles delete, or is it remove? It's remove role database save changes, and then redirect to action index. Hit F6, and let's see if that did indeed work. Let's hit delete, hit OK. Now we're going to have to wait a second because the ASP.NET server has to restart after the recompile. Another fun thing about the next version of ASP.NET is that it will indeed allow us allow background compilation of the files, meaning we won't have to any longer recompile our application when we make changes to our C# files. So I'm really excited about that myself. All right, so you'll notice that our delete action did work. In case you didn't see it, let's add in another role, try deleting it, and indeed it does get deleted. All right, so everything's looking good. Now the last thing we need to do is create our edit action. You'll see if I click on it, it says the view edit or its master was not found. Well, I mean, that is pretty sane because, well, we haven't created the edit action yet on our roles. So let's go ahead and create the action and the corresponding control, or the view and the corresponding controller actions for our edit. I'm going to create a new Razor MVC view called edit. The view model is going to be roles edit. Everything else is going to be blanked out. Then I'm going to open up my users edit. Again, it's just a matter of me reminding myself exactly how I formatted these things. So I'm going to write an h1 edit role model name. I'm going to say using HTML begin form HTML.validation summary div class form group, not form row, HTML label for name, HTML text box for name with a class set to form control. Open up our p tag, give it a input of type submit, a value of update role, and a class of button, button default, button small, or HTML action link, go back, index. All right, so this is the entirety of our edit view for our role. Let's go ahead and implement the corresponding controller actions. If I come into roles controller, you'll see we have two actions left to implement, our get edit and our post edit. All our get edit has to do is say var role equals database roles find ID. Of course, find has to be capitalized. Of course, find has to be capitalized. There we go. Then if role is null or not, role can edit and delete return HTTP not found. Then we will populate the view model. The only property on the view model is name, and we'll simply say it's role.name. Now we have to do our post action. Our post action is going to be pretty similar. We'll say var role equals database roles find ID. If role equals null or not, role can edit and delete, return HTTP not found. Then what we want to do is say if not model state dot is valid, return view form. Then we want to say role.name equals form.name. Then we want to say database save changes, and then finally redirect to action index. Hit F6, and we should be good to go. So coming back to the page and hitting refresh, we should now see a cool little edit form, which indeed we do, and it does get populated and everything like that. If I tried to change the ID to 1, notice how I get a 404, because the 1 role is not editable. Yes, I know I should probably be returning a not authorized or something like that, but Alright, so let's go ahead and edit this. I'm going to hit edit on beta testers, and I'm going to change it to alpha testers. Hit update role, and indeed our role was updated to alpha testers. Alright, so that is that's our roles. Now we can create roles for our users so that we can separate users into different groups. We're going to be, of course, using this to control access to our game. So we now have users, we have roles, and we have deploy tokens for each one of our bits that we can modify in the admin. And we can also go to this worthless admin homepage. For whatever reason, I put that in there. But yeah, I think that wraps up this video. The next video, we're going to put together the game settings page. The game settings page, like I said before, is going to allow us to allow particular roles to join the game however they want. What? That was a poorly constructed sentence. The game settings will allow us to restrict being able to log into the game based off of what role they're in. So, for example, we could have alpha testers and beta testers and blah, 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 and we'll be able to add and remove access to the game via that control. So I think that just about wraps up this video. We'll see you guys in the next one.